Aero. An aero post by Christopher J. Fergeson. I would hope that I am able to work with this. Close and accept. It seems I am having trouble interacting with the browser. Please bear with us. I will have to delete this. Please bear with me. Yes, this should be good. Automatic. What is SDR? I do not understand, but that is beside the point. This is a reading from Christopher J. Ferguson's article, Moral about evil orcs and accusations of racism in Dungeons and Dragons. In the 1980s, the popular role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons (D&D) was hit by a moral panic that lasted into the 1990s. Some people became worried that, because of some of the game's characters were demons or devils, Dungeons and Dragons might induce people to commit suicide or seduce them into Satanism. Despite the dearth of research on this question, many psychiatrists joined the panic. The makers of D&D responded by moving the demons and devils from their game, but those characters were later restored, and today most people think of the whole episode was just silly. And it was. I shall adjust it for Zoom. Now, Dungeons & Dragons, and Pathfinder, and many other tabletop games are facing a new controversy. Some people have complained that the depiction of fictional monster races, such as the orcs, promotes racism. Many D&D storylines are about the battle of good and evil, so these monsters tend to be depicted as evil by nature. But do the game's storylines or depictions use any tropes related to real-life racism? Does playing D&D promote real-life racism? And does its depiction of monster races tend to offend people of color? Or is the issue being promoted by a small number of very vocal people who hope to spread their political talking points to a wider audience? It is no coincidence that this controversy has descended upon D&D players, just as the deluge of claims about systemic racism has spilled out of academia and to other left-leaning institutions, including many media outlets, medical associations, and museums. The evidence support of this narrative has always been shaky, but moral panics are seldom concerned with the evidence. Outside these institutions, there has been general pushback against the claims, but the world of gaming journalism appears to have largely captured by the leftist narrative, and the makers of D&D, battered by accusatory headlines and Twitter mobs, have gradually made the changes in response to this new moral panic. This isn't the first time. It is far from clear that D&D's capitulation will make any practical difference in relation to concerns about racism. To see what is helpful to note the difference between the explicit use of racist tropes to describe characters on the one hand, and any particular viewer's personal interpretation of something as racist on the other. For example, some D&D products features characters called the Visanti, which describe as a race of gypsies and depict them in ways that are based in widely known cliches about the real-world Roma cultures. Thus, it would be reasonable for people to ask D&D to touch base with representatives of Roma cultures and address any feeling that they may have that this description denigrates them. Personally, I disagree. Stereotypes and the like do not cause harm, because there is a dearth and there's a plenty of evidence that shows that this is not the case. It may be offensive, but one man's offense is another person's lyric. We cannot go and keep censoring things simply because of offense. It seems unwise to have a singular culture or a singular person ever decide what is okay or not okay to consume. And if there is no malice, then there is no problem. Sure, maybe it is a question of public taste. But since when has the moral majority ever been right about anything? But I digress. The removal of the drow and the changes made to orcs and to Magic the Gathering cards in order to try and promote a more inclusive environment seem to have done the exact opposite. By contrast, the orcs are not described in terms of cliches about any real-life race. Unsurprisingly, since they are ultimately based on fictional characters in Irish folklore, and Tolkien, who made the orcs bad guys in his Lord of the Rings trilogy, explicitly noted that he did not intend them to represent any real-life people. In fact, there is no shortage of letters of Tolkien denouncing racists that equated orcs to bad, evil people or real races. After all, he said that war made us all orcs. It was the horrible ravages and truths of war that made everyone just terrible, that corrupted what was once beautiful. That's what war does. War is hell. Thus, if the thought occurs to some people that orcs remind me of Group X, it is less clear that this subjective impression is evidence that their depiction is racist, and far more likely that they are projecting their own racist tropes onto orcs. Even those who consider it racist to depict orcs as evil are only a tiny percentage of the public. They are also likely to be the most vocal and accusatory critics, and this may lead to give us their voices undue weight. Ideally, determinations about whether a given depiction is racist would be guided by well-designed research studies that produce reliable data on how widely description is experienced as racist. Then again, what is experience? That seems to be rather subjective. We seem to have movies, books, and all the like edited to fit modern sensibilities, and this does not seem to be a good praxis in a way of dealing with racism and the like. After all, this is fiction. Changing that is far easier than instituting policies of equality and actually helping communities to thrive, either by top-down government programs or by more local programs that help generate wealth and businesses. However, very few research studies have been done on D&D, and most of them have focused whether or not D&D is helpful in psychotherapy. Being a research psychologist, I decided to do my own study to explore two questions that I felt were relevant to this debate. First, is playing D&D associated with racist attitudes? And second, is there consensus among individuals, and in particular among people of color, as to whether orcs are depicted in a way that is racist or otherwise offensive? I explored these questions with a diverse sample of individuals that included both D&D players and non-players. I asked them about their leisure activities, including D&D playing, as well as the questions designed to measure their ethnocentrism, defined as a tendency to show a marked preference for one's own ethnicity and a disdain for others. I also presented them with the D&D description of orcs and asked for their reaction to it. I asked them several questions on other topics as well, to make it less obvious what I was investigating. The results were interesting and important for this debate. First, playing D&D was not associated with ethnocentrism. Being exposed to evil monster races did not tend to make people adopt racist attitudes in real life. This finding undercuts the concern that being exposed to essentialist depictions of some monsters as inherently evil would promote racist attitudes among players. Second, only about 10% of respondents found the description of orcs offensive, and their reaction didn't depend on whether or not they were D&D players or whether or not they were white people or people of color. Thus, concern about portraying orcs as evil is apparently a minority view. Even minority views have weight, but we should weigh it with reason and make sure to, because this projection of racist attitudes seems to be, although a minority opinion, seems to also not be based in any evidence or even sense. Where were the complaints earlier? This suggests that the uproar of the makers in D&D are facing are not consensus opinion, but the opinion of a very small and vocal minority, possibly because of Vanguard Group and BlackRock's investments into Hasbro, possibly because of very self-appointed people who think they're on the right side of history. This research also revealed an interesting nuance. Later in the study, I asked respondents to consider the depiction of orcs again. This time, I asked them more bluntly whether or not they found the depiction racist, and the percentage who said yes increased about 34%. I guess that's something to be said about primacy. Once again, the respondent's ethnicity didn't make a difference. Other research has shown that nearly everyone who finds something racist also finds it offensive. So what might explain why only 10% agreed that the depiction was offensive, but 34% agreed that it was racist? My suspicion is that asking people about racism produces a kind of priming effect. That is, the mere asking about racism makes some people assume that the thing you're asking about must be racist, because if it weren't, why would you ask? Ultimately, neither result proved support for activists who are demanding changes to the D&D universe. Playing D&D with monster races isn't generally associated with racism in real life, and there's no consensus about evil orcs, even among people of color. It is not clear that a minority view, no matter how vocal, should dictate the artistic direction of D&D or anything else in popular culture. Such demands are arguably bullying, demands for censorship. This would be bullying if it was done from a leftist or rightist perspective. After all, I think a video game and the creator, or of any creative work, if they wanted gender-neutral pronouns, that they should absolutely be free to do so. And they should be free from the impingement of special interest groups that should tell them otherwise. They could consider those points of view and possibly to validate their concerns, but also to stand firm against such bullying and such requests, because the author has ultimate say in what the author writes. At least that's how it should be. And censorship is innately wrong. That said, one might argue that there's no harm in making these changes. For example, one argument I hear is that if players don't like the changes, they could simply choose not to implement them and keep the evil orcs in their own game. I don't think that's a serious argument, because it would equally justify keeping the evil monster races and enabling those who object to opt for it a version with more nuanced monsters. Moreover, I suspect that there could be harm in making changes that increasingly bubble wrap these fantasy worlds, particularly in response to some people's personal, subjective judgments about whether it is what is or is not offensive. In the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt discuss the dangers of practicing what the psychologist Pamela Patersky has called safetyism. Research in clinical psychology has established avoiding what we make us anxious tends to increase our anxiety, while cultivating resilience and... please forgive me. I shall try again. In their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt discuss the dangers of practicing what the psychologist Pamela Patersky has called safetyism. Research in clinical psychology has established that avoiding what makes us anxious tends to increase our anxiety, while cultivating resilience and a sense of humor about minor irritants tends to reduce anxiety. When we shield people from irritants and stressors, and even from downright objectionable things, we actually increase their anxiety. Making fictional monster races less evil, and more into controversial topics like slavery from the game, as he also written about with Paizo and the pressure from activists that they used to remove, or at least say reduce the focus, to which I complained to Paizo, and they gave a very dissatisfactory response, to which I responded to in an email. or locating adventurers in buildings that resemble university dorms complete with wheelchair-accessible dungeons, is taking a safetyism approach to gaming, treating players as if they were made of spun glass. In countenancing these changes, we may, in enacting these changes, we may, in a small way, be contributing to what in the U.S. expert has identified as our country's mental health crisis. Another problem with capitulating to activist demands for these changes is that it tends to trap people on the apology treadmill. We know from previous experience that no apology and no changes to the system are ever enough to satisfy. They simply respond with the ungenerous rejections of the apologies and then move the goalposts, demanding further apologies. Their outreach seems intended not to achieve any specific change, but to imbue them with the power that comes with the outrage. Bullying happens, sadly, because it works. This is unfortunate. If it didn't work, then no one would do it. It's no wonder that D&D's recent changes in response to activist demands have already been met with demands for more changes. Capitulating to outrage merely invites more outrage. Reward a behavior, and you tend to get more of it. That's Psychology 101. All this suggests that the makers of D&D and other gaming systems such as Pathfinder will be better off cultivating resilience and resisting both Twitter outrage mobs and the recent tendency of gaming journalists to play the problemization game, which used to be played by mostly by postmodernist academics, and now resume to be played by very far-right Christians, especially when it comes to banning books in schools and problematic materials. Hopefully their resolve to resist will be bolstered by considering that this controversy has all the hallmarks of yet another moral panic, not too much different from the satanic cult panics of yesteryear. In fact, I want to say further that possibly, because of those changes of safetyism, it seems to infer that people of color are just less. Somehow, that they can only identify with those of themselves and must be treated with us as spun glass. I am not sure, but that seems like abuse by infantilization. And that bothers me quite a bit. I am a minority myself. Must we remove all the things that I, as a minority, and my identity? Must we remove all the references and funny jokes that I like? Should we do it should we capitulate to someone who is so offended that they must enact laws or threaten lawsuits if they are not respected? No, I don't think that is very forward-minded. I am also trying to find another video that, unfortunately, I have not considered. I have not reached out to this man for contact, but he has publicly posted this video, and I hope it will buttress the point that I'm trying to make here against the Wizards of the Coast changes, against the changes that seem to be imposed by BlackRock and Vanguard Group and many other people, firms, and investors that implement the idea of ESG, DEI, and corporate equity indexes. Let's try and take a look and make sure that I can work with OBS to have this work. The URL should proceed as thus. Oh, goodness.
Here's a thought.
Please dismiss. I do not want YouTube Red. I do not like a censored platform. I'm not sure a lot of people do. The subtitles for this video seem to be auto-generated. Let us begin.
Here's a thought. If you're going to ignore what J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, why even adapt his stories? Several months ago, I made a video about the Wizards of the Coast Tales of Middle-earth cards. Now, I'm not into tabletop games. However, The Lord of the Rings is the source for most fantasy games, so it's a no-brainer to make something like that. In recent years, however, Wizards of the Coast have leaned heavily into identity politics, so there was no chance they could create this new deck and stay true to Tolkien's descriptions of his world and characters. No, Tolkien's world of Middle-earth is too white and too male, so Wizard decided to ignore what Tolkien wrote and instead race-swapped many characters, specifically characters whose skin colors are described in the books. This obviously set off fans, which in turn set off the posers and virtue signalers, which in turn got the topic to trend on social media, which is probably what Wizards of the Coast wanted. What makes this situation different is that Tolkien's works are clearly inspired by Northwestern European cultures and are specifically built around English culture. Altering the appearance of the characters essentially strips away one of the things Tolkien wanted to do with the stories, reclaim the lost folklore of England. For those who are unfamiliar with Tolkien's works, he loved folklore, but was saddened that much of England's folklore is either borrowed from or heavily influenced by the French. The idea behind the Tales of Middle-earth is to recapture those lost stories in tone, structure, theme, and culture. And it's that last bit, culture, that's important, because culture is defined by the people who live within it, not just by their actions, language, music, and general activities, but also by their appearances. Their appearances and the preferences associated with that are woven into their culture, folklore, and mythology. When you alter the people, including their appearances, you alter their culture. With rare exception are they inseparable, and Tolkien's works are no different. His work is an English story, and as a result, the principal characters are Caucasian. However, Tolkien never states that white people are the only humans in the world of Arda. He says the opposite. There are the men of the South, Haradrim, and the men of the East, Easterlings. These two groups could respectively be considered Black and Asian. However, they are not the focus of the story. Tolkien's stories are chiefly about the elves and the men of the West, all of whom, according to Tolkien's descriptions, are white. So it's fair for people to expect any depictions of Tolkien's characters to be white, especially in cases where he specifically states that they are white, which leads us to Blaragorn, King of the Posers. Tolkien describes Aragorn as having, quote, a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and in a pale, stern face, a pair of keen gray eyes. So you got two of those wrong, Wizard. I don't see any gray eyes, and I damn sure don't see any pale skin. I also don't see Anduril, Flame of the West. I do see the Sword of Power from He-Man, and I'd like to know why you're not getting sued by Mattel. This is not Aragorn. It's not even fan fiction of Aragorn. It's a completely different character, and that's kind of the point. Leave it to Kotaku to state the obvious because why scrape the bottom of the barrel when you can just bury yourself under it? From Sauron's taint, we get this soiled insight. Quote, Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth is to be revealed in full on May 30th, when the mechanics of how the CGC will play are revealed. But ahead of this announcement has come the very welcome news that Wizards of the Coast and Middle-earth Enterprises plan to make the Third Age a far more representative time to live in. Which is to say, not everyone's white. And if you're feeling the need to start writing a comment about the ethnicity of the Scandinavian nations that inspired, just close the article down now and move on. Your blood pressure is bad enough. My blood pressure is perfect, which is why I can calmly tell you that his works are not strictly inspired by Scandinavian nations, and what influences they do have are limited primarily to the dwarves. I can also tell that you know you have a bad argument when the best clapback to criticism you can make is shut up. And that is the best argument this dude can make, because his follow-up argument is all kinds of stupid. Quote, fortunately, for those whose imagination can somehow cope with magic walking trees and actual dragons, but not different melanin content and character skin, there's still plenty of blazing white fantasy out there in which they could take solace. You do realize that's an unbelievable self-own, right? Because you're basically saying that the people you're siding with, who possess such incredible imaginations, can't cope with a single fantasy story having a white cast. These people are so fragile that if they can't see themselves reflected in the characters, meaning the characters have to look exactly like them, well, they can't even. They can't read the story, they can't relate to any of the characters. The only way they can connect is if all the characters are melanated. And this is despite Tolkien's story already including diversity via all the races, or really species. The very thing they're asking for already exists with the elves, men, dwarves, orcs, and hobbits, and how they interact with each other. If you can only see yourself in characters when they look exactly like you, you miss the point of the story. Ironically, Wizards of the Coast admits this. On their page announcing the cards, they state that they had two goals, one of which was diversity, but admit that, quote, the Lord of the Rings is about the different peoples of Middle-earth coming together to fight Sauron, finding strength in their diversity. Fans of all backgrounds have been enjoying these stories, characters, and locations for decades, and we wanted this set to reflect that broad inclusion.
Are you looking to change your mood? Well, these are full spectrum infused gummies from Hello Mood. I've been trying Mood.
This is not an endorsement. We hate this.
Products for about
It's already there in the story. Tolkien's works have been translated into over 100 different languages. People around the world have enjoyed his stories for decades. They already feel included. That's why the stories are so popular. They don't need you to do anything else but draw what he wrote. And they damn sure don't need your so-called originality. Quote, the goal of this set is to express the story and is a modern take on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, lovingly crafted for an ever-expanding fandom. No one wants a modern take on Tolkien's stories. Your job is to take what he wrote and make pictures. Your job is not to change his work. That's not just my opinion or some fan's opinion, that's Tolkien's opinion. When a Dutch publisher asked for his approval for changing the names of locations into Dutch, Tolkien said this from letter 190, quote, I hope you and the Foreign Rights Department will forgive my now at length writing to you about the Dutch translation. The matter is, to me, important. It has disturbed and annoyed me greatly, and given me a good deal of unnecessary work at a most awkward season. In principle, I object as strongly as is possible to the translation of the nomenclature at all, even by a competent person. I wonder why a translator should think himself called on or entitled to do any such thing. That this is an imaginary world does not give him any right to remold it according to his fancy, even if he could in a few months create a new coherent structure, which it took me years to work out. Right there, Tolkien slaps down this idiotic argument I've seen numerous people make, claiming that because this is a fantasy story, because none of it is real, it doesn't matter how the characters are depicted. Well, if that's the case, then why do you want to change the characters? If they can be whatever anyone wants them to be, then why can't they be like their creator intended? If it doesn't matter because it's not real, then there's no reason to change anything. The argument itself is pure nonsense because fantasy stories function under a set of rules. They have to, because if they didn't, the audience would have no idea how the fantasy world works. The general rule is that unless the author says otherwise, the fantasy world's rules follow the same rules of the real world. So, unless the author says people can fly, you should assume no one can fly. If it's based in a medieval setting, you should assume that it follows the rules of the real medieval period until the author says otherwise, and that includes who people that culture. If the culture is clearly inspired by feudal Japan, you should assume the people are Japanese until the author says otherwise. The author is the one who decides the rules of the world, and those are the rules that everyone must follow. You do not get to come in and change it just to suit you. This is exactly what Tolkien argues in his letter, quote, I presume that if I had presented the hobbits as speaking Italian, Russian, Chinese, or what you will, he would have left the names alone. Or if I had pretended that the Shire was some fictitious Loamshire of actual England. Yet actually, in an imaginary country and period, as this one, coherently made, the nomenclature is a more important element than in a historical novel. But of course, if we drop the fiction of long ago, the Shire is based on rural England and not any other country in the world, least perhaps of any in Europe on Holland, which is topographically wholly dissimilar. The toponymy of the Shire, to take the first list, is a parody of that of rural England, in much the same sense as are its inhabitants. They go together, and are meant to. After all, the book is English, and by an Englishman, and presumably even those who wish its narrative and dialogue turned into an idiom that they understand, will not ask of a translator that he should deliberately attempt to destroy the local color. Tolkien is telling the translator, the Dutch publisher, and his own publisher that the languages he created and the cultures that inspired them are integral to his work. You can't simply change them to make them more Dutch to allow the Dutch to see themselves in the story without fundamentally changing the tone and intent of his story. He takes great offense at these changes, getting into the minutiae as only Professor Tolkien could. I encourage people to read the whole letter, it's amazing. He ends with this perfect pimp slap, quote, "May I say now at once that I will not tolerate any similar tinkering with the personal nomenclature, nor with the name/word hobbit. I will not have any more humpen, in which I was not consulted, nor any hobel or whatnot. Elves, dwarves, trolls, yes, they are mere modern equivalents of the correct terms. But hobbit and orc are of that world, and they must stay, whether they sound Dutch or not. If you think I am being absurd, then I shall be greatly distressed, but I fear not altered in my opinions. The few people I have been able to consult, I must say, express themselves equally strongly. Anyway, I'm not going to be treated a la Mrs. Tiggywinkle, followed by something French that I'm not even going to attempt. Not that Beatrice Potter did not give translators hell, though possibly from securer ground than I have. I am no linguist, but I do know something about nomenclature and have specifically studied it, and I am actually very angry indeed." And that's just what Tolkien has to say about people translating his works. In different letters, he complains about the idea of people changing his words and creating art and adaptations based on his works. He was very precious about this, and with good reason. We've seen too many times what happens when people don't care about the work, but like the idea of playing in its sandbox. They destroy what was created, often attacking the original creator while doing it, and then go after anyone who likes the works as they were. This is how you get people like David Leavitt saying ignorant things like this, quote, "The same racist Nazi fuckers who complained about a black elf in the Rings of Power and a black mermaid in the new Little Mermaid are now throwing a fit because there's a black Aragorn in the new Lord of the Rings Magic the Gathering set. I fucking hate how many racists there are in the board game spaces." The only racists I see are clowns like you who think black people are so shallow that we need every character to look like us. I'm black. I love The Lord of the Rings the way Tolkien wrote it. I've read the books every year since 2003. I've watched both versions of all three films at least 20 times. I can even recite the commentary track for the sound design. You can't tell me anything about loving The Lord of the Rings or Middle-earth. I don't need those characters to look like me to relate to any of them, and I don't need your racist revisions. So keep your forked tongue behind your teeth, Snake. And by the way, the cards aren't even consistent. For example, they race-swapped Aragorn and Galadriel, two characters who are explicitly described as having pale or fair skin, but Arwen, Galadriel's granddaughter, is white. In the book, Imrahil the Fair is a 50-something-year-old white dude, but now he's a young black guy. Legolas, who's known for his golden hair, is clearly not blonde. It's literally a defining characteristic telling you what clan of elves he's from, just ignored. Then we've got Asian Butterbur, Black Hobbit, Brown Man of Gondor, Blackish Westfold Rider, but the Easternling, you know, the ones who are supposed to be Asian, now they're white. White ginger woman. What is happening?
20-minute army trick turns men in.
I'm not a fan of YouTube's ads. They seem to be the most vapid things. Because advertisers are so scared of content and the like, but still very willing to put their advertising on Cardi B songs and other more established media, we now get pseudoscience like this. It's a bit depressing.
Into beasts. This powerful special.
Because somehow with ginger woman, what is happening? Oh, it gets worse, because somehow when Gandalf the Asian dies, he's reborn as Gandalf the Black. It's the same person, race swapped. And he's not the only one. Meriadoc Brandybuck, white. Mary Esquire of Rohan, black. Same person. How is this happening? You'd think the people painting the pictures had no idea that these are the same people, but then there's clearly a mandate to depict Aragorn and Queen Cleo as black, so someone's telling these people who the characters are. How are you messing this up? But that's not the one. This is the one, and you really do need to look at the screen. Nothing is more important than this screen. Look at the screen. Here is Eomer, and here is his biological sister from the same two parents, Eowyn. How in the hell is he white and she's black if they have the same white parents? Wizards of the Coast were so busy trying to be inclusive and diverse that they didn't even keep track of the shit they were changing. And then they had the nerve to drag Elijah Wood into this and pay this man to make a video admitting that this is all just fanfiction. Yeah, we know. You didn't need to hire him to tell us that. This is why this stuff fails. It's not because everybody's a bigot. Sure, there are plenty of bigoted people who jump in to stoke the flames, but they aren't most of the people complaining and they aren't the most vocal. This stuff fails because your claims that people can't relate to these stories and characters unless the characters are exactly like them are false. Millions of people have fallen in love with Tolkien's stories and related to his characters despite looking nothing like them because people are more than just their appearances. They are drawn to his characters because they want to know more about those characters, about those people. They see the similarities in their experiences and the characters, and that gives people a better understanding of themselves and of others. That's the whole point of storytelling, to convey ideas from one person to another so we understand those around us. When you race swap characters, you aren't making some grand statement about understanding, tolerance, or acceptance. You're just telling everyone that you're so shallow and narcissistic that you can't relate to anyone who isn't exactly like you. Maybe if you stopped pretending to like Tolkien's works and actually read his books, you'll learn to think better of others and yourself. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.
It also seems to be the case that Elijah Wood was paid to do that, and rather much of a sellout. Wizards of the Coast and their parent company Hasbro, Paizo, because in the removal of the drow, seem to be acting in a very racist manner. And I don't know why they continue to get such positive ESG scores. I mean, is it because of that ESG itself, or are people just sleeping on this? Just what kind of half-baked, half-jerked little... I don't know, it just doesn't seem to be very consistent. All I know is that David Leavitt of Kotaku is being remarkably racist and calling out other people as racist. I think their advertisers should be really scared about that. I think Kotaku's articles and all of what they say should be disregarded by anyone and everyone. I wonder what Gizmodo would have to say about that. How are they still around? Especially with what they said about Zelda. Especially about what they said about Tears of the Kingdom. Kotaku has also had very dubious individuals bully developers into changing games and also being very disingenuous with their reporting entirely. Arguably slanderous. And yet, still they get money. I think there should be an email campaign, but I have no idea how to set that up. Hit them where it hurts. This is possibly not Hasbro's decision, not the decision of Magic the Gathering, but because of the big firms that invest in them. Paizo is more or less independent, so their sin is on that. In their triumphs and attempts to be more inclusive, they've seemed to have missed the point. And I think it's about time that we made our voices known, civilly, but sternly. That we cannot take this anymore. It thinks so little of POC and minority groups that it's arguably just bad. It's having a negative effect. There's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be a better way to do anything. 10 years of this, and it still hasn't worked. All right. That's all we got. Let's see if I can link this in the YouTube version. And hopefully, I can elevate the voices of good people. And along with my own concerns. Let's do what we can. I know I am. Please, have a good day.